Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we have general knowledge. Why does nobody speak this romance language anymore? This romance language. So we're zoning in a specific romance language. Not sure if it's going to be Latin or what, but it feels Latin, but we'll see. Thank you guys for being here. Let's jump right in.
And have you ever looked at a map of Europe's language families and thought, wait a minute, why is there this big leap between Italy and Romania in the Romance languages? Like, you've got Portuguese and Spanish on the Iberian Peninsula, French and Italian holding it down a little to the east, and then boom, way over on the other side of the Balkans, there's Romania, speaking a Latin-based language while
Wasn't that Thrace, which a lot of the Romans fled to? They sat refuge there, and then they grew from that.
being surrounded by Slavic language countries. We all know why Romanian is a Romance language. It has to do precisely with the invasion and occupation of the Roman Empire, which destroyed the local Dacian culture
Dacian, I said Thrace.
and replaced it with their own. But the Romans also controlled most of the Balkans, which are now Slavic. So what happened to everything in between? Why is there this big Romance no man's land from Slovenia to Serbia to Bulgaria? Well, as it turns out, that region wasn't always a linguistic void for these descendants of Latin. There used to be languages that acted as a sort of bridge, namely Dalmatian, which surprisingly was not spoken by the breed of dogs. So let's find out what this was and why it disappeared.
Do it.
Before we dive into these long-lost languages, let's zoom out for a second and get a grip on what Romance languages even are and how they got to where they are today.
I'm going to bring some pre-context of maybe not knowing. So I think Romance language really divides Germanic, barbaric languages with Roman, just like utilizing from the Western Roman Empire. I think that's it, right? Let's see if I'm right.
The name might sound steamy, but it has nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with Rome. They're called Romance because they descend from Vulgar Latin, the everyday spoken language of the Roman Empire. When Rome was at its height, it wasn't just building aqueducts and arenas, it was spreading its language of Latin. From Portugal to Syria, if Rome ruled it, likely it was Latin that echoed through the streets, often mixed with local languages, but it was there. Now, we've got to make an important distinction here. There is classical Latin, the fancy stuff you see in Roman literature and inscriptions, and then there's Vulgar Latin, the spoken, much messier version that regular people used when...
Is this a very similar hierarchical language structure as Chinese with traditional and simplified?
Talking to each other. Think of it as the difference between Shakespearean English and modern slangy TikTok English. Shakespeare wasn't writing stuff like Sigma, although he did also invent a bunch of new words at the time, like bedazzled, so maybe your local weird TikToker will be viewed as Shakespeare in 400 years too. Anyway, Vulgar Latin evolved differently depending on where you were in the empire, mixing with local languages, picking up regional accents, and generally being kind of chaotic. Fast forward a few centuries and voila, we get the Romance languages: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian, plus a couple other ones. Because after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, Latin didn't just vanish, it held on, morphing into new forms as local kingdoms and cultures rose from its ashes. In some areas, these new languages thrived and eventually became national tongues. In other places, they faded away, overtaken by political upheaval, migration, or conquest. That is the case with Dalmatian,
Well, we're really talking about the Balkans here, right? We have the Slavics, we have Croats, we have Bosnians, Serbians. A lot of these people migrated to this area. A lot of these people have lived here for a long time. So, and then of course you have like things like the Ottoman Empire occupying this area for a little bit. You have differences. Like this area is super hot with different cultures intermingling with each other. So it makes sense that there would be like a Westernish or slash a Romance gap in this little area. It really does. I'm wondering what these little area is that Montenegro? No. I'm trying to remember what is that little spot right there.
Unsung hero, or rather ghost, of Romance language history. Now, Dalmatian died out in about 1898, so there's no way that you can learn it today, but thankfully, you can still learn all the this video sizes or attach for Netflix with Linky. Every retain struggle language to try out which language send quick background context on Latin and Romance languages. Let's learn about the one that disappeared. Dalmatian was spoken along the adequately named Dalmatian coast, in what's now Croatia and Montenegro, plus a little bit of Bosnia. It came from Vulgar Latin, surviving after the fall of the empire and mixing with local Illyrian and later Slavic influences. The Dalmatian coast had a bunch of independent city-states during the Middle Ages, like Ragusa, which is modern-day Dubrovnik, Zara, which is now Zadar, and Spalato, which we now call Split. Each of these cities had its own version of the Dalmatian language, though the differences weren't huge. In fact, these dialects were often mutually intelligible, maybe like Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan are today. Dalmatian evolved in isolation but was still recognizably a Romance language, like Italy's distant, weird cousin. For centuries, it held its own, especially in maritime trade and city administration, but the linguistic tide was rising and it spoke Slavic. Starting in the 7th century, waves of Slavic migrations brought new settlers into the Balkans, and with them came Slavic languages. Croatian became the dominant cultural force, especially in inland regions, and eventually on the coast too. At the same time, parts of the Dalmatian coast fell under Venetian control.
Yeah, and we saw that with the History of Venice video by Epic History, fun plug right there, where this has just been kind of, like he's saying, there's a lot happening here, a lot of moving pieces, whether it be Venetian, whether it be Ragusan, whether it be Ottoman. It's just it's a revolving door. It's been very stable the last. It's been very stable since the Soviet blocs have really backed off, as well as like post World War II. But since a lot of that time has transpired, we're really starting to see these cultures become what they are today,
especially from the 15th century onward. And this meant that Dalmatian was being squeezed from two sides, Croatian on the landward side and Italian, or rather Venetian, from the sea. Eventually, it stopped being the language of government, trade, or even the home. Bit by bit, parents stopped passing it on to their kids. That's how languages usually die, not with a bang, but in a whisper. The final nail in the coffin came with the death of the last speaker of Dalmatian in 1898.
Wow.
Interestingly, Dalmatian isn't the only Romance language that disappeared, and in the old Iberian Peninsula, despite there being many Romance languages left today, and in this case not a gap in the territory, there was an old one that became extinct too, Mozarabic. If the name sounds vaguely Arabic to you, you're on the right track. Mozarabic was spoken here, mostly by Christians living under Muslim rule.
Okay, so we're talking like 200 years of this then.
In what is now Spain and Portugal, between the 8th and 14th centuries, when Muslim armies crossed from North Africa in 711 and quickly took over most of the peninsula, they didn't immediately force everyone to speak Arabic or convert to Islam.
I mean, that's most Muslim nations don't force. Pretty much. That's one of the things about the Muslim nations. They don't usually force on you to do this or that.
A significant Christian population remained, and they kept using their Latin-derived dialects, which were already evolving away from classical Latin thanks to centuries of local development. These Christians under Muslim rule came to be called Mozarabs, from the Arabic term mustarab, meaning Arabized, and their language was thus called Mozarabic. While the language wasn't standardized, it survived in spoken form for centuries, and we can detect its fingerprints in a few surprising places. For example, some Arabic words that later became common in Spanish or Portuguese, like aceituna, olive, and alcazar, which in Spanish means fortress. These were likely filtered through the Mozarabic dialect before becoming fully adopted. It was essentially a dialect that mixed a local version of Latin with the newly arrived Arabic people. It also had some quirks that made it stand out. Apparently, it held on to some Latin features that Spanish would eventually lose, like often retaining full vowel endings where Spanish simplified or just dropped them. Linguists love this kind of stuff because it gives us clues about how languages evolve and how contact with other cultures, in this case Arabic, can stretch and twist a language in new directions. Now, Mozarabic wasn't one standardized language either. It was more of a group of closely related dialects, a little similar to how Dalmatian varied from city to city. It didn't have a written literary tradition the way Latin or Arabic did. Maybe that's why it died out, in part, and most of what we know today about it comes from Arabic script texts. These little linguistic Easter eggs are like whispers of a lost time, hinting at a world when Latin and Arabic coexisted in the same street markets, churches, and taverns.
I mean, I think this is something that I don't think about nearly enough, and probably maybe you as well, where, there's the language of involvement. I usually just, self and like my own thoughts about it, or in terms of like how English went from like, Celtic to like more of a English Anglo-Saxon versus eventually with the Norman and conquest, which kind of evolved into more of a Middle English from like 1066 forward, and then it kind of evolved towards from Middle English to like Middle English, and then you get the Shakespearean into today, which is very much fast and loose. It's insane. It's insane, and that's duplicated across all different cultures.
So what happened to it? Why did Mozarabic disappear? Well, it was a mix of things. As Christian kingdoms like Portugal, Castile, and Leon pushed south in the Reconquista, Mozarabic speakers were often absorbed into the growing influence of standardizing medieval Spanish.
Assimilation.
Many Mozarabic communities fled or were relocated, and in their new homes, they gradually switched to early forms of Castilian and Portuguese. Over time, Mozarabic just sort of faded away. Its speakers assimilated, unique dialects were lost, and the last solid evidence we have of it dates to around the 13th or 14th century, and by then it was on linguistic life support. So, what do we make of this? Two Romance languages, Mozarabic in the west, Dalmatian in the east, that once filled in the geographic blanks but vanished under pressure from stronger languages and shifting empires. Both were relevant.
Well, it looks like Spanish is, wouldn't you guys say Spanish is a Romance language?
Of Latin's wide-reaching legacy, surviving for centuries after Rome's fall, only to eventually fade away into the background, and now living on mostly in academic papers. Romania's survival, especially when you think about what it was up against, is actually pretty impressive. After the fall of Roman Dacia in the 3rd century, the region was overrun repeatedly by
Bulgars, Huns, etc., etc.
invading powers, the Goths, Huns, Slavs, Avars, Bulgars, you name it. And despite that chaotic mix, the Latin language held on, especially in the more isolated Carpathian mountain areas. Romanian slowly evolved, absorbing some loanwords from its neighbors like Hungarian, the Slavs, and even some Turkish ones, and even a sprinkle of Greek, but yet its core remained Latin-based. It's not surprising that Dalmatian disappeared. What is surprising is that Romanian survived. When a Romanian national identity began to crystallize in the 19th century, the language was actually re-standardized, with a heavy nod back towards Latin roots, an intentional revival of sorts that reinforced its place in the Romance family, arguably to differentiate themselves from their neighbors and assert their difference and unique identity. And zooming out, the stories of Mozarabic and Dalmatian aren't unique. Languages die all the time, sometimes slowly, sometimes more violently.
And there's like, if you go to Wikipedia, you can kind of see like the list of like endangered languages.
Often it's because of a more prestigious or useful language emerging. Sometimes there's just a standardization or national borders shift, colonization happens, or even just the allure of TV and internet content in bigger languages can quietly make local speech disappear. And when a language fades away, we lose more than just the words. We lose the idioms, the histories, the ways of thinking. Mozarabic and Dalmatian may be gone, but their stories remind us of just how fragile and valuable our linguistic diversity really is, because who knows if in 1,000 years we'll just have a single European language and we'll be watching a
Unlikely, but
video called the 24 Lost Languages of Europe. So next time you look at a map and think it's weird how Romania is just there, all Latin speaking, separated from its linguistic cousins, remember, there used to be a fuller story. Dalmatian was there as a connective tissue. It may be gone, but their ghostly line is still marking the historical record. And hey, at least now you've got a cool conversation started for your next family dinner. Did you know that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool though. It's cool. A couple of things. One, Romania. I wonder if you guys have any answers to this. Like, I wonder how much of their internal culture derives from Roman Empire in terms of like their identity. They believe themselves Romans in a different light. You know, I'm interested there. Another thing, when he said, I mean, the European language things in it, right? Because it'd be hard for it, I don't ever see that happening. English is the number one like language in terms of international culture for the West, but really close second is French, and French is, I believe, like one of the languages the UN uses. I forget, it's a premier language of some sort. And French speaking is very much a diplomatic usage, especially for the UN and the EU, etc. So it'd be interesting. I think English and French are just so big, it'd be hard to ever see a unification of the language. Same with like Germanic and then Russian, which has like so many bleeds of things, as well as like all the other different languages within Italy, Spain, Spaniel. Come on, like so I don't know, but 1,000 years is a long time, so we'll see what happens then. I'll see you guys in 1,000 years, and until next time, oh, bye bye.